Okay, so, one of the things that I think we both saw in the stuff that you sent over is all this issue about staying focused when you're studying. Like, it's something that I think everybody deals with.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you sit down with the best intentions, you got your coffee or your tea or whatever it is that gets you going.
Yep.
And, then like 10 minutes later, you're like, oh yeah, I was going to make a sandwich or...
right, or what was I even
doing?
Yeah, exactly. And especially, I think, with the stuff that you sent me, it seemed like maybe the thing that you're dealing with the most is like you're juggling a lot of different sources. So it's like,
oh yeah,
how do I stay focused when it's like I've got 4 different things? Right.
And it's not just like reading one book.
Yeah.
Front to back. It's like, okay, I got to read a little bit of this and then go check this website and I got to listen to this podcast and then it's like at the end of it, I'm like, I don't even know what I just did for the last 2 hours.
Totally.
Yeah. So that's kind of what we're going to try to dive deep on today and really kind of go through some of the most important tips and strategies that we can find that are backed by science. We're not just going to be making stuff up today.
Yeah, we're not just spitballing.
Yeah, we're going to try to go through what the research actually says works.
Yeah, exactly.
And kind of the first step of that is, I think we got to understand, like, why is it so hard to stay focused in the first place? Like, why do we lose focus so easily?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because sometimes we tend to think of focus as like a willpower thing.
Oh, totally.
Like, oh, I just didn't have enough willpower.
I didn't try hard enough.
Yeah, I didn't try hard enough. But actually, there's a lot of other stuff going on there. So, a lot of the articles that you sent over that we're going to talk about today, they talk about a lot of those reasons.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the first things is just like the obvious, like the distractions. Like,
oh my gosh, yeah.
It's like we are bombarded with distractions.
Right. And I mean, I feel like that's only getting worse. It's getting so much worse.
As time goes on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like every app wants your attention.
Yes.
All the time.
Every website, like every, TV commercial is like screaming at you, like, give me your attention.
Totally. And so many of the articles that you sent talked about that. And the one that I thought was really interesting was the one that talked about like the actual cost of distractions. Like it actually takes your brain a really long time to get back on track after you've been distracted.
Yes. And that one really stuck with me too. I think they said it takes like 23 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, something like that, which is crazy.
It's like, oh, I'm just going to quickly check this text message. And then it's like, half an hour later, you're like, what am I doing?
Yeah, totally. It's like, oh, that was harmless. But really, it's like you've lost so much time.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a huge one. And then, another one I think is just like, sometimes the stuff we're trying to study just isn't that interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Like, let's be honest.
Like, I'm not excited about reading this textbook.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that, some of the research that you sent, especially the behavioral psychology stuff that you sent, talks about this, like, your brain is really attracted to new things and like things that are going to give you like a reward or like a dopamine hit.
Oh, for sure.
But if you're reading something that's really dry and boring, it's like your brain is trying to find anything else to do.
Yes.
So it makes it really hard.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this in some of my notes, like I sometimes hit this wall where it's just like, I cannot absorb another word of this. Like, I just can't do it.
Totally. Yeah.
So what do we do about that? Like when the material is just not grabbing us, like how do we...
Well, I think one thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting is trying to connect the material to your own goals.
Oh, yeah.
So like if you're studying something that feels really dry and boring, it's like, well, how does this actually connect to the things that I care about or like what I want to do in the future?
Right.
Because like one of the articles you sent talked about this idea of value-based learning.
Yes.
Where it's like if you understand why you're learning something, you're way more likely to actually remember it and to stay focused on it.
Like, what's the point of this?
Exactly.
Right. And once you can see that connection, it's like, oh, okay, now I'm actually interested in this.
Right.
And then the other thing I think is just like, we got to talk about study habits. Like, because sometimes the way that we study is actually working against us.
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the articles that you sent talked about this, where it's like, if you're just cramming at the last minute.
Oh, yeah.
Or if you're just kind of like rereading your notes over and over again, but you don't really have a plan.
Right.
It's like, that's actually going to make it harder for you to focus.
No, yeah.
Because you're basically setting yourself up to feel overwhelmed and confused.
Right. It's like if you're trying to build a house, but you don't have a blueprint.
Exactly. Yeah, you're just like throwing stuff together and hoping it works.
Yeah, and then you end up with like this weird Frankenstein house that like
Yeah.
Doesn't actually
Definitely.
function.
Yeah, exactly. And then you're like, why isn't this working?
Right. So I think, now that we kind of understand, like, why we lose focus so easily, like, let's talk about some actual solutions.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think the first one that really stood out to me from your stuff is, like, the environment, like the physical space where you're studying.
Yeah. And I think we tend to underestimate that.
Totally.
Right. We think like, oh, as long as I'm comfortable, I can focus anywhere.
I can focus anywhere.
But actually, a lot of the research that you sent, especially the stuff about environmental psychology, talks about like the really powerful impact that your physical space can have.
Yeah. And one of the first things that they talk about is like having a dedicated study space.
Yeah.
Like, not just like, oh, I'm going to study on the couch today, or I'm going to study in bed today,
Yeah.
but like having a place that is just for studying.
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that, and one of the articles that you sent talked about this, is this idea of context-dependent memory,
Oh, yeah.
which basically means that your brain starts to associate certain environments with certain activities.
Okay.
So if you always study in bed, your brain's going to start to associate your bed with like relaxing and sleeping.
Right.
And so it's going to be harder for you to switch your brain into study mode when you're in that environment.
Makes sense.
So it's better to have a dedicated space like a desk or a table somewhere that your brain knows, okay, this is where I study.
Right. And I'm guessing lighting is important too. Like, you don't want to be straining your eyes trying to read in like a dimly lit room.
Absolutely. Yeah, you want to make sure you have good lighting so that your eyes don't get tired, because that's just going to make you want to stop studying.
Yeah, totally. And while we're talking about setting up this space, I think one thing that I mentioned in my notes is that, like, I feel like I get so overwhelmed when there's clutter around me.
Oh, yeah.
Like, visual clutter just like really messes with my focus.
Yeah, and that's a really common experience. And actually, there's research on this too.
Really?
Yeah, one of the articles you sent talked about how clutter can actually lead to cognitive overload, because it's like your brain is trying to process all of this visual information at the same time.
Oh, wow.
And so it's harder for you to actually focus on the task at hand. So yeah, it's really good to like take a few minutes to clear off your desk,
Okay.
put away anything that you don't need for that specific study session.
Like, don't have like all your textbooks piled up there when you're only working on one.
Exactly. Yeah, just have the things that you need, like your notes, the textbook that you're working on, maybe a drink of water.
Right. Okay.
And that can really make a difference.
Okay, so dedicated space, good lighting, clear the clutter. And then, the last thing I guess is like, what about music?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Because some people are like, oh, I need music to focus. And other people are like, I need total silence.
Right. And the research on this is kind of mixed, but I think the general consensus from the stuff that you sent is that if you're going to listen to music, it should be instrumental music.
Yep.
So like no lyrics, because the lyrics can actually be distracting.
Right, there's like another thing for your brain to try to process.
Exactly. Yeah. So things like lo-fi beats or classical music or even just white noise.
Okay.
Those can be helpful for some people. But if you're someone who really needs silence, then definitely stick with that.
Okay, so we've got our space set up. We're feeling good. We're ready to go now. What's the actual study technique that we should be using?
Well, one thing that came up a lot in the stuff that you sent was this thing called the Pomodoro technique.
Yes, I've heard of that, but like, can you remind me like how it works again?
Yeah, totally. So basically, it's a time management method where you break your study session down into these intervals.
Got it.
So usually you work for like 25 to 50 minutes.
Okay,
And then you take a short break for like 5 to 10 minutes.
gotcha.
And then you do that 4 times, and then you take a longer break for like 15 to 30 minutes.
Okay, kind of like interval training, but for your brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like sprints and recovery periods.
Right. So, but like, why is that so effective?
Well, there's a few reasons. One is that it helps to combat mental fatigue.
Okay.
Because if you know that you only have to focus intensely for like 25 minutes,
Right.
it's kind of easier to stay motivated and engaged.
Right.
The other thing is that those breaks actually help with memory consolidation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it gives your brain a chance to kind of process the information that you've just been taking in.
Oh, wow.
And then the third thing is that just psychologically knowing that you have a break coming up
Right.
can actually help you to resist distractions during those work intervals.
Okay, that makes sense. And you even mentioned some apps that can help with this.
Oh yeah, there's tons of them out there now.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just like timer apps that you can use, but then there's also some that are kind of more gamified.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, so like one that I really like is called Forest. And basically it's a timer, but while you're working, it grows a virtual tree.
Oh, cute.
And if you leave the app, the tree dies.
Oh, no.
So it's like this little incentive to stay focused.
Oh, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. So, okay, we've got our study space. We're using Pomodoro. But, like, what about the elephant in the room?
What's that?
Our phones.
Oh, yeah.
Like, our phones are the biggest distraction.
I know. And you called that out a lot in your notes.
I did.
It's like the #1 thing.
They're designed to be addictive.
Exactly. Yeah, and you sent me some really fascinating research about like the psychology of social media.
Yeah.
And it's scary how these apps are designed to keep us hooked.
Yes.
They want our attention all the time.
All the time. So, like, what do we actually do about it?
Okay, so the first thing, which I think is kind of obvious, but it's worth saying, is put your phone on Do Not Disturb
Okay.
so that you're not getting notifications and calls and all that stuff.
That's a good one. That's an easy one.
Yeah, and then if you're working on your computer, there's actually some really cool apps that you can use that will block certain websites.
Okay.
So like you mentioned cold turkey and stay focused in your notes.
Yeah.
Those are great because you can set them up to block like social media or whatever websites are distracting you.
So you're just like, I can't go to Facebook for the next hour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
And then the other thing, which I think is really powerful, is just to physically separate yourself from your phone.
Oh,
So,
boy.
like, put it in another room while you're studying.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's actually research on this too. Like one of the studies you sent, it showed that even just having your phone nearby,
Okay.
even if it's face down,
Uh-huh.
can actually reduce your cognitive performance.
Really?
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like this anticipation of a notification is enough to like take up some of your brain power.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, out of sight, out of mind is a really good strategy. Okay, so we're doing all this stuff, but then I think there's also this element of like, I don't even know where to start sometimes. Like I sit down and I'm like, what am I supposed to be doing?
Totally. And that lack of clear goals can definitely lead to distraction.
Yes.
Because if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, it's easy to kind of like wander off track.
Right. And I know you mentioned this thing called SMART goals in your notes.
Yes. SMART goals are a great way to kind of like create a roadmap for your study session.
Okay, so SMART, like what does that stand for again?
Okay, so it stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Okay, so like how would you apply that to like an actual study goal?
Okay, so let's say your goal is to learn about the French Revolution.
Okay.
That's kind of vague.
Yeah, very vague.
So a SMART goal would be something like, by the end of this 45-minute study session, I will be able to list and explain the 3 main causes of the French Revolution using the textbook chapter as my primary source.
Okay.
So that's specific because you know exactly what you need to do. It's measurable because you can check if you can list and explain those causes.
Yeah.
It's achievable because you're giving yourself a reasonable amount of time.
45 minutes. Yeah.
It's relevant because it's obviously relevant to what you're studying.
Yes.
And it's time-bound because you've given yourself a deadline.
45 minutes, okay.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. I like that. And you also mentioned writing those goals down.
Yes, writing them down is really important
Okay.
because it kind of like solidifies them in your mind.
Right.
And it also makes you more accountable.
Like I said I was going to do this, so I should probably do it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the environment, we've talked about Pomodoro, we talked about distractions, we've talked about goals, but I think there's also this other element that we have to consider, which is like our own physical and mental health.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
How are we taking care of ourselves?
Yeah. And I think it's easy to forget about that when we're so focused on like, okay, I got to get this studying done. But actually, your physical and mental state have a huge impact on your ability to focus.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Like if your body is not functioning well, it's really hard for your brain to focus.
Right. So like what are some of the things that we should be doing to kind of take care of ourselves?
Okay, so the first one, which again might seem obvious, but it's so important, is hydration.
Drinking water.
Yeah, drinking water, because even mild dehydration can actually affect your cognitive function.
Oh, wow.
And you sent some research about that?
I did.
Like some physiological studies that showed that.
Okay.
And then the other thing is nutrition.
Food.
Yeah, eating a balanced diet, and especially making sure you're getting enough omega-3 fatty acids.
Okay.
Which, you know, those are found in things like fish and nuts.
Okay.
And those are really important for brain health.
So brain food.
Brain food, yeah, exactly.
Okay. And what about exercise?
Exercise is huge.
Okay.
Even just short bursts of exercise can really improve your focus
Oh, wow.
because it increases blood flow to the brain and it also helps to reduce stress.
Right. Because stress is a big focus killer.
Yeah, totally. And some of the stress management articles that you sent talked about that.
Okay.
And then, of course, sleep.
Oh, yeah. We all need that.
But it's especially important for learning and focus.
Okay.
So most adults need around 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night.
Okay.
And that's because when you're sleep deprived, your attention span really suffers.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the last thing that I saw in your notes was this idea of mindfulness and deep breathing.
Yeah, those are great techniques for kind of like training your attention muscle.
Oh, okay.
So they help you become more aware of when your mind is wandering.
Right.
And then they give you tools to kind of gently redirect your focus back to what you're supposed to be doing.
Good.
And they also help to reduce stress and anxiety, which, again, are huge barriers to focus.
Yeah, so it's like taking care of your whole self is actually helping you to study better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
That's really cool. And then, the last thing I think we should talk about is just like, how do we stay motivated? Like, how do we keep ourselves going when it's just like, I don't want to do this anymore?
I think rewards are really important.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because studying can feel like a grind sometimes.
Yeah, it does.
So if you can build in little rewards for yourself along the way, it
Okay.
can make a big difference.
So like what kind of rewards?
It really depends on what you enjoy.
Okay.
So it could be something as simple as like after you finish a certain task, you get to have a healthy snack.
Right.
Or you get to listen to your favorite song, or you get to take a 5-minute break to do something relaxing.
Okay.
And then for bigger accomplishments, like after a really productive study session or like after a whole day of studying,
Yeah.
maybe you treat yourself to something bigger, like a hobby that you enjoy or watching an episode of your favorite show.
Okay. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
And any pitfalls to watch out for?
Yeah, I think the main thing is to be careful about the types of rewards that you choose. So like, for example, it might be tempting to be like, oh, I'm going to take a social media break as a reward.
Right.
But then that can easily turn into like an hour of scrolling.
Oh, yeah.
And then you've completely lost your focus.
Right. So short and sweet.
Exactly. Yeah. So try to choose rewards that have a clear endpoint.
Mm-hmm. I like that. So I think to recap, we've got a lot of great strategies here. We've got, create a dedicated study space.
Yep.
Use the Pomodoro technique.
Brr.
Minimize those digital distractions.
Yeah.
Set clear, smart goals. Prioritize self-care and reward yourself.
Exactly. And I think if you can start to incorporate some of these strategies into your study routine, you're going to see a big difference in your focus and your productivity.
Yeah. So the challenge to you, dear listener, is to take some of this stuff and actually try it out this week.
Yeah.
Like pick 1 or 2 things that really resonated with you.
Yeah.
And just see what happens.
Yeah. And as you're trying these things out, I think it's also interesting to think about like which of these strategies feel like they could become a part of your like long-term learning routine.
Oh, yeah.
Like not just for this week, but like how can you integrate these things into your life so that you can be a more focused and engaged learner all the time?
I love that. And I think that's a great place to leave it for today.
Yeah, I think so too.
So thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.